Scott, thanks.
Thank you, Scott. And I just want to say thank you, everyone, for sharing your amazing startups. I've been going to startup competitions for the past 15 years or so. And the energy is the same, the technology might be different, but you all are facing a lot of the same types of problems. For the past 20 years, I've been doing intellectual property law. I started out doing mostly pharmaceutical work, and then I was fortunate enough to jump to the software-based side, which really opened up a whole another world. 5 years ago, I started my own law firm so I could work more with startups. And when you're working as a startup attorney, you kind of are involved in a lot of the legal strategy, a lot of the management strategy, and they kind of just turn to you to general advice. So it's really interesting to see how startups work and some of the best practices. And maybe more importantly, for some of you startups here, I actually work for some major international corporations that acquire startups. And my job for them is to do due diligence on the startups, to see how their intellectual property works, whether it's worth acquiring, or any major problems that the startup might have had during their initial years that will kind of lead to them either being something they should buy or something they shouldn't buy. And I'm going to go over that type of information. So one of the first questions you have in the travel technology space, because a lot of it's so software-based, is can I really get a patent to protect my invention? And software recently has been having a number of problems with the quote-unquote patentability of being able to get a patent. So there's a new law, or recently a new case law in the United States that said it's much more difficult now to get patents on software-based inventions. Fortunately, that pendulum's swinging a little bit back, and if you do it the right way, the answer is yes. And I don't have a, here we go. So I decided to go and look at two of probably the best known travel technology companies that we've talked about a couple of times already in the conference. The first is Airbnb. And the good news for startups is that actually filing for patents, which can be expensive, is not super, super critical. A lot of people say, well, I have to get as many patents as I can, and it will cost you a ton of money. But in the case of Airbnb, which was founded in 2008, they did not even apply for a patent until 2013. So their first, in 2013, they applied for 4 patents, then 6 patents, 8, 7, 6. And as you can see, they're not really ramping up. They say, maybe patents aren't that important for us. We're doing pretty well. And let's leave it at that. And if you think about Airbnb, their basic concept is pretty simple. Let's rent out some rooms in people's houses. And they probably have a fairly simple, at least at first, software application to do that. So that maybe there's not a lot patentable there. But let's think about another popular one, Uber. So Uber, you say, well, they have all kinds of technology. Their app does all those amazing things. But still a very similar story. In 2009, they were founded, and they applied for 2 patents. And you say, well, what happened in 2008, 2007? I'll get to that in a minute. And 2010, low. 2011, low. 2012, low. 2013, low. Meanwhile, they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars of funding in different tranches in this early stage. And then all of a sudden, they start getting really serious in 2015, 2016. At that point, they're not really a startup anymore. They have tons and tons of money. So why are they doing that? The biggest reason there is that in 2017, there was a lawsuit by Waymo against Uber. So this is the first time that, and Google actually owned Waymo, and they said, hey, we're getting into the driving market too. Let's see if we can take some of Uber's market. And so all of a sudden, patents are really important. So they start applying for more patents, and they're gearing up for a potential patent war, which hopefully you'll get to that time in your career sometime soon. That means your company's doing incredibly well and you're making maybe $1 billion. But it's always best to avoid that. So the Waymo suit was actually not based on patents. It was based on something fairly simple, which I'll get to here. It was based on an NDA agreement. So what I would recommend for all startups at the very beginning is to get the very basic, most simplest form of IP that you can in place. An NDA agreement is a non-disclosure agreement, and it could also be tied to an employment agreement, where all your employees have to agree that if they leave your company, they're not going to go tell the next company they work for all your trade secrets. And that's incredibly important. And a lot of times you're working with your friends and like, oh, they'd never do that to me. But it happens. And so it's a very, very simple 2-paragraph agreement, but it has tremendous amount of protections in the trade secrets area, which is what happened in the Google suit. They ended up settling for $244 million because they hired someone that violated Waymo's NDA. So you didn't need millions of dollars worth of patents, you needed a simple NDA, which I recommend everyone does. And also, for software, trade secrets are incredibly important. And it's basically saying, I'm choosing to keep my information secret. I'm not going to put a patent out there that tells the world how to do it, but it's going to be our secret sauce. But in order to do that, you have to have certain protections in place in order for the trade secret to be valid. One of them is an NDA. Another one is to not share information with anyone that shouldn't have that information. So if you went out to 1 million investors and said, okay, all 100 of you, my friends in this room, I'm going to tell you how our program works. You know, you should say, well, it works in a black box. You know, if you really want to invest in our company, at some point we can let you into the data room, but there's going to be all these levels of protection. So it's kind of administrative, but trade secrets is kind of this area that you have to have as many protections as you can in place, and then people will say, well, if you ever get into a legal battle, well, you know, they were kind of loosey-goosey and everyone knew this, or it was available here as well. They might have published some of this in open source code, and then your trade secrets would be invalidated. So just keep your information close to your chest. Another really nice thing for startup companies and a cheaper way to get a patent, we saw with Google, I mean with Uber and Airbnb, they filed maybe 1 or 2 applications early on. You can file a provisional patent, which is much cheaper than a full-scale utility patent. And it's kind of a 1-year placeholder, so you can just deposit all your information. It doesn't have to be written out in legalese, or you don't have to hire an attorney, and say, here's what we're basically doing. And that gives you 1 year to decide with what you were doing last year is working still and it's worth getting a patent. So it gives you some time in case you pivot and say, well, this new thing is actually more important to us now, so let's focus on this. You don't have to waste all of your money. How am I doing on time? Okay. So here's the information that might be interesting for people that are planning to exit sometime soon. One of the biggest things I see with software-based companies is they use a lot of open source software. And there's all kinds of different open source licenses out there. Copyleft, copyright. And a lot of times larger companies don't want to have any of the obligations that come with a lot of these software licenses. So if you were obligated, if you use this software to then share it with everyone else in the world, a copy forward license, a big company would say, well, we're going to put a lot more money into this and do all these other things to the code, and we don't want that information to be publicly available, so we can't accept this license, and your fundamental software is not good for us. That is not to say that they dislike open source code. They just dislike certain types of open source code. So they're looking for, if you use open source codes with no obligations, that's completely free and you can do whatever you want and there's no commercial restrictions, they're fine with that. But if you're looking at some of the other licenses that are a little bit trickier, then they might be more hesitant to do so. And unfortunately, open source licenses are going everywhere. There's probably 30 or 40 different open source licenses right now, so it's a little bit tricky. You might need a little bit of legal advice to figure out which open source licenses are good and which ones are bad. Another common thing is ownership. So back in the employment agreement, you should also say, if you develop an invention while working at my company, it belongs to the company. And it's just a little piece of paper that says, I agree that all my inventions will be assigned to you. Oftentimes, and I worked with this with a Swedish startup, one of the founders left. He didn't sign an assignment agreement, and that meant they could never actually apply for any patents, which is really important in this case because it was a mechanical invention, so people could easily copy that. So an assignment agreement is something that is simple and cheap and should be used by all startups. Another big problem is if you actually say, well, I just need a patent. Doesn't matter what it is, I'm going to go spend some money on a patent. If your patent doesn't actually cover your product, if you just have a basic patent that your product might have pivoted, then you would say, well, this patent has really nothing to do with what you're selling or the valuable part of what you're selling. So it's kind of just money wasted and time wasted. So if you can't get anything that actually covers what you're doing, then I would recommend not wasting the money on that type of patent. And then finally, competitors' IP can be a big problem. So we saw a lot of pitches that were kind of similar, and maybe they're doing things a little bit differently. And who knows which one of those might actually go to market. So there's, for whatever reason, someone's going to do a little bit better. Maybe they get lucky, the right amount of money, they just start growing rapidly, and someone else might have had IP on that, but not so lucky. And if that IP is sitting out there, then the company that's buying it will say, well, what about this really great patent from the other company? So if you monitor what your competitors are doing, like you do with your little comparison charts saying how our companies are different, you might want to also say, well, does this company have any key IP? And if they do, then you might want to change what you're doing just a little bit, or the way you do something, so you can avoid infringing their intellectual property. And it's much easier to do that when you're starting to develop your product than after your product's already been developed. You have to go back and try that again. So that said, I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah, thanks.